Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. Before we get too much farther into November, I thought I'd do my October Marginalia video, the video where I just identify any short stories, poems, essays, whole books that I read across the past month and didn't do any videos about. Sometimes I plan to do videos and don't get to them. And then a couple of quick, fun musical recommendations at the end, of course. But we're going to start off with a writer who I absolutely love, and that's Loren Eiseley. So Loren Eiseley was sort of in the generation of naturalists, natural science writers before Stephen Jay Gould. And Stephen Jay Gould's one of my favorite writers on sort of biology, ecology, popular science, and sort of a slightly more academic take perhaps on than just pure popular science, but very readable. Loren Eiseley hits all of those things, but he does it with this sense of poetry that is just beautiful. And so this is from one of the essays. Some lands are flat and grass covered and smile so evenly up at the sun that they seem forever youthful, untouched by man or time. Some are torn, ravaged, and convulsed like the features of profane old age. Rocks are wrenched up and exposed to view. Black pits receive the sun but give back no light. Thank you. I'm in. The essays across the first book in here, The Immense Journey, are fantastic. They're really, they're eminently readable. They really do have that sense of poetry, of imagery. Eiseley finds himself part of the stream of life, and he wants to share what that means for him with his readers in a way that is fantastic. I'm looking forward to getting into the firmament of time, certainly before the end of this year. And if I can, I'm going to hopefully do a full proper video on The Immense Journey because it's so darn good. I am continuing reading Uwe Johnson's Anniversaries. We got to the break the fourth wall point, or sort of the postmodern hysterical realism part, where Johnson actually inserts himself into the book at a conference he had attended in New York City in the spring of '67, and he has a character in his novel reflecting on attending that conference and sort of seeing him as part of the symposium and these pretty aggressive and hostile questions he was taking. I'm still trying to identify exactly what it is beyond its length that makes this an extraordinary novel, but I keep holding out hope. I do think the passages in the 1930s that are showing the rise in power of the Nazi Party and what that means in a German village and for a couple of different sort of classes of German society at that time is a little bit more interesting than what's going on in 1967. But we'll see. Let's see. In terms of poetry, I reread the poems of Lalala. I collected in Lalala, and my daughters and I read 10 each night for a sequence of about 2 weeks. And they really enjoyed it. My younger daughter especially, she was going and finding this book on my nightstand. Our older daughter goes and counts the books on my nightstand and then goes 27, 28, whatever number it is. But our younger daughter really enjoyed this, and she would say, "Is it time for Lalala?" And she would go look through my nightstand and get the book and then carry it with her to her bed. So we were really enjoying this. I did a video in May on these poems, and so I'll link that in the description box. But it was really good to return to those. This might become something that I'm rereading every other year or something. So I read the second set of Anne Sexton's complete poems, and those are titled All My Pretty Ones from 1962, and they definitely feel darker. With Sexton, I think to a large degree the poems start in a very dark form of confessional poetry and then just continue to go darker and darker as she is coping with life and coping with what she sees as her reality. As I was reading the posthumous memoirs of posthumous memoirs of Bras Cubas by Machado de Assis and loving it, I was just diving into all sorts of works that I was reminded of, among those being the Epigrams of Martial. And then once we finished Lalala, we've been diving into the Penguin Book of Irish Poetry, particularly focusing on ballads. The sing-song nature of ballads are something that my daughters really enjoy. But this is a fantastic volume. This is going to keep me company for the next 20 years to finish. I really enjoyed the great cover too. They're a little scared of the cover, but they like the poetry in here. And I'm certainly enjoying it as well. We've hit some medieval poetry, we've hit some from the 17th century, and then we've certainly hit some more modern poetry. And then within the complete works of Primo Levi, Levi, again, most famous as a memoirist, specifically of the Holocaust, then probably for his book, The Periodic Table, short stories that sort of draw on both his memoirs and his training as a chemist. I read his early science fiction stories, Natural Histories, but I also have been dipping into his poetry, particularly his poetry from the 1940s. And this man had a very special voice and an ability to examine the horror of reality and try and transmute it into something that had a meaning, that he didn't want his life reduced just to those horrors. So it just getting into his complete works has really been an eye-opener outside of just his memoirs. Now, jumping into some essays. We have the collected essays of Elizabeth Hardwick. This doesn't have all of her essays, and Elizabeth Hardwick was a fantastic essayist. She wrote some very solid novels, but I think as an essayist, as someone who paid attention to language and paid attention to the form of writing, she has very few peers. And so, again, sort of inspired by reading posthumous memoirs, I was looking in her, she has a couple of essays, Memoirs, Conversations, and Diaries, Anderson, Millay, and Crane in their letters, where she's examining the ways in which writers write, people write letters or write their memoirs, and how that is sort of by design. There's an artifice to it. Or how the posthumous editing of their letters or memoirs, again, there's a design or artifice to that. The Subjection of Women is a fantastic essay. As was Paradise Lost, an essay that is an absolute takedown of Philip Roth, which I'm all here for. So these were really enjoyable. These aren't all of her essays, by the way. There's a whole other collection, I believe, from NYRB that focuses on her essays in drama, focusing on drama, and specifically some of Ibsen's plays, which I'm looking forward to acquiring at some point. I have continued reading from When the World Spoke French, edited by Marc Fumaroli, and he has these introductory essays in which he's exploring the relationships between different people who were not French but wrote in French, letters often or memoirs in French, and he's exploring those relationships. And so it was interesting reading through Catherine the Great, a Russian princess, the Abbe Galliani, who was sort of hysterical, I'll be perfectly honest, and then various people who are writing to the Marquise de Dufan, including both Voltaire and Horace Walpole. Oh no, not Horace Walpole. Walpole's the younger Walpole. From the Edogawa Rampo reader, again recommended from the Codex Cantina, I read Poison Weeds, and then I read The Phantom Lord. Poison Weeds was very, very intense, without ever being explicitly a horror story. I don't want to go too much into it, except to say that there's basically some plants that someone casually mentions what those plants could be used for, and then it becomes clear by the end of the story that the use of those plants has exponentially increased in the village. So Rampo continues to be a writer I discovered this year, and I'm very pleased that I discovered. I found the complete stories of Clarice Lispector in October, down in Tucson, and I have jumped in and read several. The Triumph, Obsession, The Fever Dream, Jimmy and I, and A Chicken. So the first four of those are all from her early stories. Of those, I most enjoyed Jimmy and I. I really got into that story. The others were interesting and strange, but Jimmy and I had I guess a more human connection that when juxtaposed with the strangeness, felt more intensive. And then A Chicken was from her second collection that was recommended by a couple of different readers. And it's a story about this heroic escape by a chicken that doesn't want to, be eaten for dinner. And then what happens with the chicken, with a twist ending, of course. So I'll continue to be digging in there. A couple of new ones. The Unknown Masterpiece. And then also, what was the other one in here? Gambara by Honore de Balzac. I loved The Unknown Masterpiece. I think it is a fantastic short story, and I will be discussing this at more length in January. It's an amazing story. I did not enjoy Gambara nearly as much. I thought it was taking the same theme of The Unknown Masterpiece around this concept of like true art or art's reflection, art as a reflection of life, and then life, the way art influences life. And I thought that was amazing. Gambara, I thought, was kind of a long mess. It felt like something that Henry James would have written, not Honore de Balzac. And then from Hugo von Hoffmannstahl, I read the Lord Chandos letter, which is just entitled A Letter. But I'm going in January to do a Jonesing for Janus, again, a soft launch, Jonesing for Janus video in which I explore those concepts between the Unknown Masterpiece and a letter, the Lord Chandos letter by Hugo von Hoffmannstahl, and sort of this sense of the way that they're exploring the artist's relationship to life and the artist's duty to reflect life. Let's see. From Kathleen Collins, I read Only Once, and then I read Conference Parts 1 and 2. Kathleen Collins is a really great writer. It was certainly lost too young. I was fortunate to find another edition that has her actual screenplays and drama and some stories that aren't in here, and then even some letters and memoirs and such. So my wife has that book right now, but Conference Parts 1 and 2 was really enjoyable. From Joy Williams, Taking Care. Somebody referenced Joy Williams as a writer they really enjoy, and I got to thinking, like, I really enjoy Joy Williams as well. So I dug out this great volume of her short stories from Vintage Contemporaries and enjoyed rereading The Yard Boy. From Charles W. Chestnut, who again is fantastic, sort of turn of the century, writing right in the aftermath of Reconstruction, when the white supremacists have regained control of the southeastern United States and are enacting Jim Crow. Charles Chestnut was writing his stories and his novels, and he has a number of stories in which a character who was a slave when younger is telling these stories to like someone who's moved down from the north, and they sort of get into there's some cultural ethnography there, and they're really interesting. They're told in a vernacular, and so I read Marsh James' Nightmare, which is very effective. I read from Donald Barthelme, again, thinking sort of Machado de Assis. I read his stories that are within Unspeakable Practices and Unnatural Acts from 1968. Most of those are collected in the 60 Stories edition. It might be a little while before I jump back into Donald Barthelme. When it works, it works. The story The Balloon was fairly interesting. The story The Indian Uprising was fairly interesting, but those were the exceptions. The others feel, again, there's that artifice I was mentioning earlier. There's an intentional artificial nature, I think, in some of Barthelme's stories, where it feels like he's trying to make them more convoluted rather than experimenting. That rather than experimenting to see what occurs, it's just let me tinker and intentionally do something that doesn't make sense, not for any actual purpose of the story. But I did think The Balloon was strong, and the Indian Uprising was very effective as well. I read a number of stories in my Ithaqua cycle. So Ithaqua was referenced early on in The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood, but there are a number of others. So I read The Thing That Walked on the Wind and the Snow Thing from August Derleth, Born of the Winds by Brian Lumley, They Only Come Out at Night by Randy Meadoff, Footsteps in the Sky in the Country of the Wind by Pierre Comtois, and then Stalker of the Wild Wind by Stephen Mark Rainey. There was one that was set during the 1919 Russian counter-revolution, when the whites and reds were fighting over Russia. And that story in particular was quite strong. Some of the others were interesting. They're good cosmic horror stories. and that was enjoyable. I did find myself dipping back over to Ramsey Campbell and reading his short story, The Moon Lens, which is quite horrifying, set in his fabled Goats Woods in the Severn Valley. And then the last piece was Charles Lamb, who's a huge influence on Machado de Assis. And again, as I was reading Posthumous Memoirs of Bras Cubas, I just wanted to be spending time with other influences, Lamb being one of those most profound influences. And I read a number of his letters because that was really what Machado de Assis was reading. But I also read some of his essays, including his autobiography, and he leaves a line at the end to basically put in like what day he dies and where he's buried, and he makes a note to be filled in posthumously by so and so. So I did read those, and that was curious to explore. And then I read a couple of his early London essays, The Londoner and The South Sea House and The Old Benchers of the Inner Temple. So Charles Lamb lived an interesting life. His sister was mentally ill and murdered their mother. And so he then spent a good portion of his life trying to care for his sister and deal with sort of the aftermath of that. But he had conjured sort of this alter ego, in a sense, not quite a pen name, but really like this alter ego, Elia, who would write essays around London and such. And then he was close friends with Coleridge, and a frequent correspondent with Coleridge. So those were interesting. Now, in terms of the music, I wanted to identify a couple of quick ones. One of these was stolen by my good friend Brian from Bookish because I shared it with him in my excitement. And then he highlighted it. But I'm going to highlight it again because it is that good. It's the song Black Myself from Amethyst Kaya, which is, I think, her album this year is my favorite album that I've heard released this year in 2021. Wild Turkey, the song that follows it on the album, is quite good as well. I'm going to link in Game Is My Middle Name from Betty Davis. Betty Davis was a singer. And the songwriter, she'd had I want to say a top 40, but not top 10 hit in the mid 60s, and was a model who married Miles Davis. And she was part of sort of a musical group with, Miles Davis, Sly and the Family Stone, Jimi Hendrix. And she was part of that circle in the late 60s in New York City. She and Miles Davis then divorced. They were only married for, I want to say, a year and a half, maybe 2 years. They divorced, and in the aftermath of their divorce, he does his jazz fusion with Bitches Brew. And she, a couple of years later, released several like really heavy-duty funk albums, really good ones. And so, "Game Is My Middle Name" is one of the songs from her self-titled album. And then I'll include "Total Entertainment Forever" by Father John Misty because our younger daughter really likes that song across the past month. So, this is my October Marginalia, and we'll see what November holds. Have a great one.